She walked into the ICU like she always had, calm, covered, competent. But this time, something was different. A memo was waiting. Remove your hijab, it ordered. New policy. Immediate compliance required. She didn't protest, didn't shout, just whispered one word, no. In a sterile hospital where faith had no place, Samira El-Fayez chose obedience over employment. They called it a safety hazard. She called it surrender. And when a dying man requested her not by name but by scent, everything changed. What happens when the quietest person in the room carries the loudest truth? Press 1 if the story pulled you in. Press 2 if it didn't. But whatever you press, don't scroll until you've seen what conviction looks like. Samira El-Fayez read the memo just after dawn while the city was still wrapped in sleep. It came from the hospital's compliance department, marked urgent, dressed in cold fonts and legal phrasing. She scanned through unfamiliar phrases until one line settled in her chest like a stone dropped in water. Effective immediately, all staff in sterile zones must comply with uniform sterilization guidelines. Religious or cultural head coverings are not permitted unless issued by hospital control. She read it again and again. Then she folded her phone screen down, tied her hijab with steady fingers, and left for her shift. Hôpital Saint-Clair stood like a monument in central Paris, ivory pillars, glass walkways, a symbol of secular modernity. Samira had worked here for 9 years. She was quiet, precise, the kind of nurse whose presence lowered heart rates without medication. She'd walked families through grief. She'd whispered to newborns whose mothers hadn't survived labor. She had once stood for 23 hours straight during a surge and never complained. But none of those stories were in the memo. That morning, she walked through the hospital entrance like always. Same blue scrubs, same sterile cap over her veil, same quiet nod to the front desk nurse. But something in the air had shifted. No one said anything, but silence speaks too. By midday, the whispers began. She's still wearing it. Hasn't she read the policy? Why make it a thing? Even her closest colleague, Marion, avoided eye contact. That hurt more than the memo. Samira didn't respond. She never did, because she didn't wear her hijab to be noticed. She wore it because her soul had made a promise. At the end of her shift, she passed through the back corridor to the changing room. The lights flickered. A janitor nodded to her quietly. She returned it with a smile. Then she sat on the bench and unfolded her prayer mat. Not in defiance, in need. And as she bowed in sujud between lockers and forgotten coats, she whispered, Ya Rab, let me lose everything, but not you. She stood again, wiped her eyes, folded the mat back into her bag, and prepared for what she already knew was coming. By the second day, Samira could feel the shift, not in what was said, but in what wasn't. Colleagues who once shared jokes during coffee rounds now offered stiff nods. The woman who used to braid her daughter's hair in the break room avoided her entirely. Even Marion, her closest peer, greeted her with a neutral bonjour, then turned back to her screen. The air had changed. Whispers clung to scrub stations like static, and Samira moved through them like wind through leaves seen but untouched. Almost. In the staff kitchen, 2 junior nurses were whispering over lukewarm tea. She's still wearing it, she was told, wasn't she? I don't get it. Just take it off during shift. It's not like it's permanent. Samira stood silently nearby, waiting for the kettle. They saw her. Neither stopped. But she didn't respond. Because some convictions aren't defended in kitchens. They are lived through quiet dignity. That afternoon, as she was charting vitals in the ICU, her supervisor approached. Dr. Camille Bernard Young, confident secular, a rising star in the hospital's hierarchy. Samira, she said, low and cautious, we've been asked to gently remind non-compliant staff that failure to adhere to Protocol V47 could result in review. I understand, Samira replied. Camille hesitated. Then, why? Samira looked at her, not angrily, not emotionally, just clearly. Because the one I wear it for never asked me to remove it for policy. Camille exhaled, exasperated. Is it really worth your job? Samira didn't blink. My job didn't give me this, and it can't take it from me. By the third day, the silences turned into meetings. HR called her into a small glass office with minimalist chairs and walls that made privacy feel performative. Across from her sat Mr. Laurent, the hospital's compliance officer. Madame El-Fayez, he began, We appreciate your years of service. We know you are beloved by patients and peers. There it was, that soft, polite preamble that always came before erasure. But he continued, uniform policy is not about religion. It's about safety. I agree, Samira said softly. That's why I've worn a sterile cap over my hijab for 9 years without incident. He shifted. This is about cohesion, public trust. Samira tilted her head. And what about God's trust? He paused. We're offering compliant headgear. I'm not refusing protection, she replied. I'm refusing to hide surrender. Outside the meeting room, the day carried on. Alarms beeped, IV bags emptied. Patients whispered prayers without knowing the name of the nurse who once whispered back. But inside, a decision had already begun to crystallize. Mr. Laurent leaned forward. If you do not comply within 48 hours, we'll have to consider neutral suspension. Samira nodded once. I understand. He waited for her to respond, to plead, to negotiate. She didn't, because obedience to God cannot be negotiated in glass offices. That night she returned home late. Her mother was sitting cross-legged on the prayer rug, rosary beads in hand. Samira placed her bag down quietly and sat beside her. They've given me 48 hours, she said. Her mother didn't ask what for. She already knew. Instead, she said, when I first wore the veil, I did it trembling. Samira looked up. Her mother smiled gently. I thought people would laugh, thought my job would vanish. But your grandmother once told me, there is no safer place to stand than behind your Lord. Samira's throat tightened. She whispered, I'm scared. Her mother reached over and placed a hand on her cheek. Then pray with your fear, not against it. The next morning, Samira walked into the ward exactly as she had every day. Same steps, same scent of antiseptic, same badge clipped near her chest. Only now it felt like the walls were watching. A folded note waited in her locker. No name, no signature, just 5 words. You make me want courage. She folded it gently, placed it next to her ID, and walked into the ward, not with defiance, but with something much quieter and far more powerful. Certainty. The 4th day began with frost on the windows and a kind of chill that didn't come from weather. Samira entered the ward early. The halls were still quiet, pre-dawn silence, where machines hummed and time moved slowly. She checked on the cardiac patients first, adjusted a monitor, silenced an alarm, documented vitals. Her hands worked from memory, but her heart, it braced. At 7:42 a.m., Marion approached. Not as a colleague, as a messenger. The review is being moved up. This afternoon, she said, eyes flicking to Samira's scarf. They want to resolve it quickly. Too much attention. Samira didn't flinch. Will you be there, she asked. Marion hesitated. I don't think I should. Samira nodded. I understand. But Marion's face flushed with shame, and silence hung like a confession. Later that morning in room 214, Samira checked on a patient named Jean, an elderly woman recovering from cardiac surgery. As Samira tucked a blanket around her, Jean reached out and touched her wrist gently. You smell like jasmine, she murmured, eyes soft. Samira smiled. It's just lotion. Jean shook her head. No, it smells like kindness. She paused. They're giving you trouble, aren't they? Samira blinked. How did you? I may be old, dear, but I know when a woman is being stared at like a scandal. Jean held her hand a little longer. My daughter says faith is outdated, but I've seen a lot of things in this life. I trust what I feel. She looked Samira in the eyes. You make the room feel warmer. Don't let them turn you cold. By lunch, the staff lounge had emptied around her again. Samira sat with her tea alone at a table where laughter once lived. She stirred sugar slowly, listening to chairs scrape quietly away. But not all silence was rejection. Around 1 p.m., Malik, a junior respiratory intern, approached awkwardly, with his badge still flipped backward. Samira, right, she looked up. He fidgeted. I wanted to say, what you're doing? I'm not doing anything, she said gently. Just continuing. He paused. It's brave. She shook her head. It's obedience. Malik's voice dropped. My mother wore hijab until she started working at the embassy. Took it off to blend in. She never said it hurt, but I saw her cry the first time she walked out the door. Samira listened, She used to tell me, "It's not the cloth they fear, it's the courage underneath it." Samira folded her hands. Then she was right. At 2:45, she was called to Sal 5, a glass conference room on the hospital's ground floor. Inside sat the tribunal. Mrs. Valerie Rousseau, head of compliance, 2 infection control officers, a representative from HR, and the hospital director, Dr. Etienne Caron, a man known for policy, not mercy. A single chair faced them, no table, no comfort, just a microphone and a row of administrative expectations. Mrs. Rousseau began, her tone clipped and bureaucratic. "Mademoiselle El Fayez, this is a formal inquiry into non-compliance with Protocol IC-47. Samira nodded. "You understand the consequence of ongoing refusal may include unpaid suspension and potential dismissal." "I do." "Do you still refuse to remove the hijab during sterile procedures?" "I do." Dr. Caron adjusted his glasses. "Would you consider wearing a trust-approved sterile hood that conceals it?" "I've considered it, and I decline." Rousseau leaned forward, while Samira's voice remained calm. "Because my hijab is not simply fabric. It's not a tradition or preference. It is a command I carry from God. If I cover it to ease discomfort, yours or mine, I betray something more sacred than my career." The room was silent. Even the pen stopped moving. She continued, "For 9 years I've worn a sterile cap over my scarf. No patient has suffered for it. No infection has ever traced back to my presence." She glanced across the panel. "But even if the risk was imagined, my choice remains. Because obedience doesn't fluctuate based on whether others agree. It's not about convenience. It's about conviction." The HR official spoke this time softly. "Is your faith more important than your profession?" Samira smiled gently. "My faith is the only reason I do this profession well. I don't serve because I'm strong. I serve because I remember who I'm accountable to." As they called for a short deliberation break, Samira stood. She turned, walked to the window and whispered a quiet prayer. "Ya Allah, let me leave with my honor intact even if I lose everything else." The tribunal had ended. No verdict yet, just the cold echo of chairs scraping, papers shuffling, and professionals pretending neutrality didn't tremble under conviction. Samira walked out quietly. No dramatic exit, no applause, just footsteps and faith. She didn't check her phone, didn't return to the staff lounge. She simply went back to her ward, to the work that had never judged her. It was nearly 3 a.m. when the call came. The ICU was dim, pulsing in shadows and soft machine beeps. Half-asleep nurses moved like ghosts between beds. Nurse Elodie approached Samira carefully. "There's a request," she whispered. Samira looked up from her chart. "Room 409, new transfer from Saint Raphael. Palliative. He's speaking?" "Barely." Samira nodded. "What's the request?" Elodie hesitated. He said, "I want the Jasmine nurse." Samira blinked. A beat passed. Then she stood. She already knew. 4 months earlier, during a rotation at Saint Raphael, Samira had cared for a patient with advanced renal failure. Unresponsive, withdrawn, angry. He had never spoken, never responded, but once, only once, when his hands were cracked and bleeding, she had massaged jasmine-scented cream into his skin. He hadn't said a word, but he hadn't pulled away either. She remembered his name, Henry Moreau. And now, he was here. Room 409 was dim and still. Henry lay frail beneath a gray blanket. His face was thin bones pressing gently beneath sallow skin. But when Samira entered, his eyes, sunken and tired, lit slightly. "Hugh," he rasped, voice like paper tearing. She stepped closer. "You remember?" He nodded slowly. "You never talk too much." She smiled, still not great at speeches. He chuckled weakly, then coughed. "I heard they're making you choose." Samira's throat tightened. "I've already chosen." Henri studied her face, or rather what he could see. His gaze lingered, not with suspicion, but with something else entirely. Understanding. "I never got it. The cloth," he whispered. "But when I was dying, you made me feel like I wasn't invisible." Samira blinked back tears. He continued. "You didn't sell me hope. You sat in silence with me, like it wasn't about curing, just caring." She reached out and gently took his hand just as she had months ago. It was still dry, still trembling, but now it curled around hers without hesitation. Henri looked toward the ceiling. My daughter, she stopped visiting, said she couldn't handle the decline. He sighed. But you didn't leave, Samira whispered. I'm still here. A long silence passed. Then Henri said the last full sentence of his life. You smell like safety. He passed at 4:08 a.m. No alarms, no code blue, just a gentle exhale. Samira stayed at his side. She closed his eyes, straightened his blanket, and whispered a prayer, not loudly, just enough for the soul to hear on its way out. May you meet Mercy Henri, the kind that doesn't ask for names or paperwork. By morning, the ward buzzed with the quiet electricity of a story spreading. A dying man asked for her by scent, didn't even remember her name, said she made him feel safe. Some rolled their eyes. Others paused. Because while policy speaks in documents, dignity often speaks in death. Later that day, a sealed envelope was left on her locker. No sender listed. She opened it gently. Inside was a handwritten note. You helped my father die with peace, not because you showed him your face, but because you showed him God through your hands. Imaro Samira folded the letter slowly, pressed it to her chest, and whispered Alhamdulillah. Not for praise, not for proof, but for the mercy of being part of a moment that no camera could capture and no law could erase. 2 days after Henri's death, Samira received the summons. Final tribunal, decision day. The email was cold and professional, but between its lines she could read everything it wouldn't say. They had waited long enough. Her quiet resistance had gone on too long. The matter needed to be resolved before her silence grew contagious. The hearing was held in a converted conference room, fluorescent lights overhead, gray carpet, rows of folding chairs arranged like courtroom pews. Samira arrived on time. Not early, not late. Veil-pressed posture, composed prayer complete. She wasn't there to defend herself. She was there to bear witness to the choice she had already made. The panel sat facing her. Madame Rousseau again, the HR solicitor, 2 infection control officers, and this time the hospital's deputy director. Behind them, a few allowed observers filled the back row staff from different departments, a few nurses and intern or two. Samira didn't search for friendly faces. She'd learned not to measure support by applause. Ms. Elfayez Rousseau began, We are here to issue our final review. Unless there is new evidence or change in position, the panel is prepared to conclude this matter. Samira nodded once. I understand. Before we proceed, the HR solicitor added, Do you maintain your refusal to comply with Protocol IC-47? Samira folded her hands in her lap. My answer remains the same. I cannot remove my hijab, even if it means dismissal. Even then, the panel began listing evidence, sterility reports, national compliance data, legal precedents, everything quantified, everything packaged, everything sterile. Samira listened without reaction, because while they argued about fabric, they had never once mentioned faith. Then came a knock at the back of the room. Everyone turned. Dr. Emile Dubois, chief of palliative care, entered briskly, holding a sealed document. My apologies, Chair, he said. This just arrived from the family of Henri Moreau. There was a murmur through the room. Madame Rousseau adjusted her glasses. Dubois handed her the envelope. Inside was a notarized statement from Eleanor Moreau, Henri's daughter. In his final hours, my father requested one person, Nurse Samira Elfayez. He did not know her name. He remembered her presence, her hands, her calm, her scent. My father died in peace because someone who followed her faith quietly and fully reminded him what dignity looked like. To question her place in the ICU is to misunderstand healing itself. Rousseau finished reading. No one spoke. Even the solicitor didn't blink. Then from the back of the room, another voice broke the silence. It was Nurse Leah Patel, Samira's former breakroom companion, the one who once brought samosas and now hadn't spoken to her in weeks. She stood. I'd like to add something, she said quietly. The panel hesitated. Rousseau gave a reluctant nod. Leah took a step forward. When my mother was admitted here last year, it was Samira who stayed past her shift, held her hand, spoke verses over her when she was scared. Her voice wavered. My mother left this hospital infection-free and full of hope. I don't know how many studies measure hope, but it healed her more than antibiotics did. She stepped back. No one objected. Then came a final interruption. Malik, the intern, raised a hand nervously. The latest infection audits, he said, holding up a file. ICU sterility reports show no increased infection risk from religious garments when covered with trust-issued sterile caps. Samira's Bay reported fewer post-op infections than the ward average for 3 consecutive years. He swallowed. Science isn't at odds with faith. Ego is. Silence again. But it wasn't the heavy silence of tension this time. It was the reverence that follows when truth arrives so gently, no one knows what to do with it. Madame Rousseau cleared her throat. Ms. El-Fayez, if we allowed you to continue with your current method, sterile cap over hijab as you have always worn, would that satisfy your conscience? Samira met her gaze. I never asked to be exempt. I only asked to be allowed to remain obedient. Rousseau looked down. The others conferred quietly. Then the verdict came. No suspension, no penalty. Continued duty permitted with sterile cap over hijab. A task force will be established to review religious accommodations. In uniform policy, Samira invited to join. Samira didn't cry, didn't smile. She only placed her hand over her heart and whispered, Alhamdulillah. Not for winning, but for not bending, and for leaving that room with what mattered most, her conviction intact. The news didn't make headlines. There was no announcement over the PA system, no celebration in the break room. But the next day when Samira walked into Hôpital St. Clair, something had changed. Not the rules, not the hierarchy, not the silence, the perception. Where eyes once followed her with suspicion, now they paused longer, searching, not scrutinizing. Where lips once tightened, now they offered brief, hesitant nods. She didn't expect apologies. She didn't want them. She just wanted to serve. And now she could do so without removing her reverence. In the cardiac ward, Nurse Leah Patel left a cup of tea on Samira's desk. No note, just jasmine, steaming softly. Samira took a sip and smiled, because some gratitude doesn't arrive with words, only with warmth. That afternoon, she was called to pediatrics for a short consult. In room 12, a child undergoing chemo clutched a toy doll tightly. The doll now had a ribbon wrapped around its head. When Samira entered, the girl pointed excitedly. She's like you, she beamed. My nurse doll? Samira knelt beside her. What's her name? The child thought hard, then said proudly. Amira. Samira blinked, laughed softly. A good name. The girl nodded. She helps people without taking her scarf off. Samira squeezed the child's hand. She sounds strong. In the staff lounge, things thawed slowly. Marion approached her one evening holding a chart. Hey, I owe you. Samira looked up. I froze when I should have stood beside you, Marion admitted. Samira shook her head gently. No one owes me anything. We all find our courage at different speeds. Marion's voice cracked slightly. Still, thank you for not holding it against me. Samira offered a small smile. I didn't come to court anyone's conscience. I just came to keep mine clean. Later that week, the first meeting of the hospital's multi-faith task force convened. 6 people around a circular table, a Jewish midwife, a Sikh cardiologist, a Christian surgical nurse, and at the head, pen in hand, Samira El-Fayez. The facilitator, a Senegalese Muslim chaplain named Idris, began the meeting with a verse. There is no compulsion in religion. Qur'an 2:256, then added gently, but there is strength in sincerity. One by one, the staff shared their stories. The Jewish midwife, who had been told her headscarf made patients uncomfortable. The Christian nurse, who had once been reprimanded for quietly praying beside a failing patient. The Hindu orderly, who'd been laughed at for fasting during long shifts. Samira listened, truly listened, because obedience isn't proud, it's present. By the end of the meeting, they had outlined the start of a new policy draft. Sterile accommodations for faith-based garments. Dedicated prayer spaces for on-call staff. Protection clauses against silent discrimination. Samira signed the paper last. Her ink smudged slightly on the final line. But the words were still clear. Sincere faith is not contamination. It's a contribution. That evening, as she left the building, she passed the same janitor she always greeted. He leaned on his broom and said with a toothy grin, "Sister, they tried to make you remove cloth." She laughed and failed. He winked. "No, they didn't fail. They helped you show us something stronger." She placed her hand over her heart. "Barakallahu feek," he chuckled. "I don't speak Arabic, but I felt that." At home, her mother waited by the window. As Samira placed her bag down, her mother walked over with something wrapped in linen. "Your grandmother wore this in Algiers," she said softly. "She marched in it, was arrested in it. They ripped it from her head once, and she said, 'They can't strip me of what was never stitched by their hands.'" Samira unwrapped the fabric, an old hijab, faded but lovingly preserved. She pressed it to her face. Tears came quickly this time, not from fatigue, but from the weight of lineage. That night she prayed long, no requests, just gratitude, and whispered into her palms, "Ya Allah, let the ones who come after me never have to fight to keep what you gave them. But if they do, let them know you are worth the cost." Spring arrived in Paris quietly like an apology. The cherry blossoms near the hospital gates burst open in delicate pinks, and the wind carried their petals through the same corridors where silence once weighed like judgment. Samira arrived early for her shift. As always, same steps, same scrubs, same hijab beneath her sterile cap. But now her badge had changed. Beneath her name, Religious Accommodation Task Force. Founding member. She hadn't asked for it. Someone had added it without telling her, a quiet acknowledgement that even institutions could learn. She moved through the ward with her usual calm. In room 218, a teenage girl named Zaina lay staring at the ceiling. 18, veilless, eyes like shuttered windows, attempted suicide, severe depression, family estranged. When Samira entered, Zaina's eyes flicked briefly toward her, then lingered on her scarf. "You don't take it off?" Zaina asked softly. Samira shook her head. "No, not even here." Number Zaina was quiet for a long moment, then whispered, "They made me wear it. I hated it." Samira sat beside her. "I understand," she said gently. Zaina's voice cracked. "But you, choose it." "I do." Why? Samira looked at her, not with Dawah, not with pressure, just sincerity. "Because I stopped needing to be seen by the world and started wanting to be seen by the one who made me." Zaina didn't say anything, but as Samira stood to leave, she saw the girl gently pulling the hospital blanket over her head, as if testing what it felt like to be covered, in the safest space she'd ever known. Outside, the city hummed as usual. Taxis honked, cyclists weaved through traffic. But inside Hôpital Saint-Clair, something small had shifted. Not loudly, not officially, but deeply. At lunch, Samira stepped into the courtyard. She sat on a stone bench beneath the blossoms. A soft breeze blew petals onto her lap. As she sipped tea, a woman approached, mid-40s, professional blazer, a hijab tucked in elegant folds. "Excuse me," the woman said in French-accented Arabic. "You're Samira El Fayez." Samira nodded cautiously. The woman smiled. "I'm from NHS Midlands. We're designing a new interfaith protocol. Someone on your task force shared your story. We were wondering..." She hesitated, then added, "if you'd be willing to help shape national policy, not just for hijab, but for all religious expression in healthcare." Samira blinked. "I'm not a scholar," she replied. "No," the woman said. "You're something rarer. You're sincere." That evening, Samira returned to room 409. The bed was empty now. Henri was gone. But the scent of jasmine lingered, faint like a memory that didn't want to leave. Housekeeping had left a folded blanket and a small note on the counter. "Some patients leave scars. Some leave lessons." He left behind a silence that felt like peace. "We think you had something to do with that." Samira placed her hand over the blanket and whispered, "Ya Allah, grant him light in the grave." She didn't need to be seen, but somehow she was still being felt. Back home, her mother greeted her with a kiss on the forehead. "You didn't just keep your hijab," she said softly. "You kept your niyyah." Samira sat beside her on the prayer rug. "Was it worth it?" her mother asked. Samira smiled. "They tried to make me remove a cloth, but Allah used it to remove veils from hearts." A week later, she received a pale pink envelope in the post. Inside was a photograph, a little girl in a school uniform hijab, freshly wrapped, smiling wide. On the back, in a child's handwriting, "I wore mine today. Like you. Mama said you help people without showing your face. So maybe I can help too. No name, it's just your little admirer from Ward B." Samira placed the photo on her desk, right beside her Qur'an, then closed her eyes and whispered, "Ya Allah." Let her grow up knowing that her worth is not in who sees her, but in who she follows. The next day she walked into work as always. No fanfare, no headlines. Just a nurse in Paris, wearing surrender as her strength. Not for revolution, not for recognition, but because faith isn't a flag, it's a lamp, held high in quiet hands so others can find their way to the light. In a world that prizes compliance over conviction and visibility over virtue, Samira El-Fayez's story reminds us that true strength doesn't always shout its stands. Her hijab was not an act of rebellion, but a daily prayer stitched into silence. She didn't confront power with fury, but with stillness rooted in surrender. And in doing so, she taught a forgotten truth. Dignity is not granted by policy nor removed by protocol. It is lived in the quiet decisions we make when no one else understands. We all face moments where we must choose between what is easy and what is eternal. Samira chose God, and through that choice, others began to see with new eyes. This story is not just about faith in hospitals, it's about remembering that when you carry light within you, you don't have to prove it. You simply walk, and the shadows make way. He was the mind universities worshipped, a world-renowned atheist philosopher, debated priests, dismantled dogma, his weapon logic, his mission to prove God was a myth. Until one day, he vanished. No farewell lectures, no last publication, just silence. Then a photo leaked. There he was, barefoot, in sujud, whispering La ilaha illallah. The man who once mocked faith now bowed to the one he said didn't exist. What did he find in the Quran that no argument could break? What happens when logic meets revelation? And loses? Press 1 if this story pulls you in. Press 2 if it doesn't. But stay till the end, because when pride falls, truth doesn't argue. It simply remains. Dr. Malcolm Reyes was the kind of man who could dismantle belief systems with a sentence. At 52, he was the reigning authority on secular metaphysics at Cambridge, a decorated philosopher, best-selling author, and veteran of televised debates that left pastors, priests, and imams equally disarmed. His book, The Illusion of Meaning, was considered a modern classic in academic circles. Cold, articulate, and intellectually lethal, Reyes had become a living embodiment of unapologetic reason. He had once said before a packed auditorium, "God is a placeholder for unanswered questions, nothing more. And if your faith can't survive the light of logic, it deserves to die in it." He was not unkind, just unwavering. In his world, certainty belonged to logic. Emotion was weakness, and religion, well, religion was a beautifully structured myth, good for comfort, but unfit for truth, until Islam came up. Whenever students asked him about Islam during office hours or panels, he would pause, not in fear, but in measured hesitation. He didn't mock it like he did Christianity. He didn't dismiss it like he did Eastern mysticism. "It's different," he once admitted. When pressed, he elaborated, "Islam doesn't beg you to believe. It dares you to deny." That kind of confidence, it unnerves me. He had always kept his distance from the Quran, not because he feared it, but because it felt like a conversation he wasn't ready to have. Not yet. That changed when he was invited to keynote the global conference on philosophical realism in Istanbul. The topic assigned to him, the myth of monotheism. Why God is a human invention. He smirked when he read the title. It was bold, controversial, perfect. He packed his notes, his argument polished and sharp, built on centuries of philosophical dissection, from Plato's forms to Nietzsche's hammer. He would walk onto that stage and deconstruct the divine. Or so he thought. In Istanbul, beneath domes older than his home country's founding, something stirred. He couldn't name it. It wasn't belief, it was tension. After his lecture, clinical and devastating as always, a young Turkish philosopher approached him quietly. "I don't want to argue," the student said. "I just want to offer you this." He handed Dr. Reyes a small pocket-sized English Qur'an. Dr. Reyes raised an eyebrow. "You know I don't accept gifts of persuasion?" The student nodded. "It's not a gift to persuade, it's a mirror. Read it not to refute, but to recognize." Reyes said nothing, but he took the book. Later that night in his hotel room, the Qur'an lay unopened beside a stack of Greek texts. He stared at it for a long time. Then finally, with a sigh and a smirk, he whispered, "Let's see what kind of God survives my logic." And he opened to the first page. The first thing that struck him was the tone. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't pleading. It was sovereign. This is the book in which there is no doubt a guidance for those conscious of God. Quran 2:2. He stared at the verse. It wasn't an opening. It was a declaration. No introductions. No flowery preface. Just truth stated without apology. He flipped forward expecting theological abstractions, something soft he could unravel with Hume or Kant. Instead, he found verses that sounded like commands issued from a realm he'd spent his life denying. Say he is Allah the One, Allah the eternal refuge. He neither begets nor is born, nor is there to him any equivalent. Quran 112, 1-4. He reread it, slowly, carefully. There was no metaphor to dissect, no symbol to reinterpret, just absolute oneness, untouched, undivided, unmatched. He leaned back in his chair, brow furrowed. "This book isn't trying to inspire," he muttered. "It's establishing authority." Still, he pressed on, more intrigued than he wanted to admit. He read through Surah Al-Baqarah. He circled phrases like, "Do you not reason? Do they not reflect? Do they not contemplate?" It didn't shame thinking, it commanded it. Unlike scriptures he had previously dissected, the Quran didn't seem afraid of being questioned. In fact, it invited scrutiny over and over again. Had it been from other than Allah, you would have found within it much contradiction. Quran 4:82. He blinked. It wasn't a belief claim, it was a challenge. The Quran wasn't trying to win him emotionally, it was inviting him to disprove it, and that made Dr. Malcolm Reyes nervous. Because he had never encountered a religious text that sounded this sure of itself, this unwilling to be patronized. He pulled out a red pen and began marking passages, looking for contradictions. He wanted to trap it in inconsistency. That was his method, his comfort, but it wouldn't crack. Every verse linked to another, every story pointed backward and forward. Even the shifts in voice, divine, prophetic, human, were layered with a kind of rhetorical precision he couldn't reduce to historical accident. He reached Surah An-Nahl, "And whatever of blessings and good things you have, it is from Allah." Quran 16:53, he felt the weight of that. Not because it was philosophical, but because it bypassed philosophy altogether. It was truth speaking in its own tongue without borrowing his. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, eyes on the ceiling, his thoughts louder than the city noise outside. This is irrational, he told himself. But it wasn't. In fact, that was the problem. The book wasn't irrational. It was too rational, too deliberate, too surgically precise. If it were full of myth, he could reject it. If it were emotional, he could pity it. If it were contradictory, he could dismiss it. But it wasn't any of those things. It was something worse. It was coherent, and coherence was dangerous. Because if the Quran was consistent, then its claims about God, prophethood, and truth couldn't be ignored. By morning, he was angry. At the book, at himself. At the calm he felt every time he read it. He told himself it was an illusion, a literary trick. But when he opened it again, his hands trembled. He turned to Surah Al-Hajj at random. "O mankind, fear your Lord. Indeed, the convulsion of the final hour is a terrible thing." Quran 22:1. For a man who had built his entire life on the elegance of logic, the weight of that verse landed with a strange kind of fear. Not emotional fear, but existential exposure. For the first time in years, Malcolm Reyes felt small. Not because the book overwhelmed him with grandeur, but because it spoke with the calm of the Creator, the kind of calm that doesn't raise its voice, because it doesn't have to. He scribbled a sentence in his notebook. The Quran does not argue, it reveals. And beneath that, if I keep reading, I may not win. He closed the book, but it was too late, because it had already begun reading him. Dr. Malcolm Reyes had never known what it meant to lose an argument, not truly. In university halls, television debates, and academic journals, his words had been his fortress, his mind a scalpel, his method unshakable. Isolate the premise test. The logic exposed, the cracks dismantled the illusion. It always worked, until now. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't dealing with a flawed thesis or a superstitious worldview. He was dealing with something that didn't flinch. The Qur'an didn't wait to be analyzed. It spoke, and worse, it answered. He tried to regain control. He opened his philosophy notebook and began writing out a structured critique. Premise: the Qur'an is a human text. Goal: identify internal contradictions, irrational claims, emotional manipulation. Method: apply classical rationalism, linguistic deconstruction, historical comparison. But every time he thought he found a thread to pull, it dissolved in his hand. He turned to Surah Al-Mulk. Do you see any flaws in the creation of the most merciful? Look again. Do you see any breaks? Qur'an 67:3. He read it aloud. Then again. It was as if the book knew exactly what he was trying to do. And it was 2 steps ahead. He went back to the beginning, searching for anthropomorphism, divine actions that could be attributed to myth or emotional projection. Instead, he found verses like, there is nothing like unto him, and he is the all-hearing, the all-seeing. Qur'an 42:11, he whispered to himself, transcendent but aware. It wasn't a God sculpted in man's image. It was a being that shattered categories altogether, a being that knew. He opened a new document on his laptop and began typing, working paper, notes on a text that resists reduction. He wrote for hours, not analysis, but confession. This book doesn't read like it was written. It reads like it was spoken, not once, but eternally. Its style breaks classical form, but never loses clarity. It's not linear, yet nothing feels misplaced. It doesn't build a case, it declares reality, then invites you to catch up. This isn't theology, this is confrontation. He leaned back in his chair and whispered, I'm losing this argument. That evening, he skipped the conference dinner. He walked alone through the old streets of Istanbul, past bookshops, domes, and fountains, still whispering the call to prayer, even when the speakers went silent. He sat on a bench near the Blue Mosque. A child ran past him, barefoot, laughing. A man on a bike delivered bread to a tea shop. A cat jumped into a woman's lap as she recited Qur'an beneath a sycamore tree. Everything felt ordinary, and yet Malcolm felt exposed, as if the veil of self-importance was finally wearing thin. He returned to his hotel and opened the Qur'an again. This time he didn't read to challenge. He read to understand. And the verse that greeted him was, we will show them our signs in the horizons and within themselves until it becomes clear to them that it is the truth. Is it not enough that your Lord is a witness over all things? Qur'an 41:53. He didn't write it down. He just stared at it. Because he knew it was already happening. The signs in the horizons. The signs within himself, all converging towards something he had spent his life avoiding: surrender. He closed the Qur'an gently as if not to wake it, and for the first time since arriving in Istanbul, he knelt beside the bed, not in prayer, but in awe. He didn't know the words. He didn't know the rituals. But deep in his heart, the philosopher whispered, you are beyond my mind, and I am finally okay with that. The keynote lecture was scheduled for Friday. Seats were full, cameras mounted, reporters ready. The program read, Dr. Malcolm Reyes, The Myth of Monotheism. Why God is a human invention, but he never showed up. At 9:14 a.m., an email was sent to the organizers. I'm unable to deliver this talk. My argument has collapsed under further scrutiny. I no longer find the thesis intellectually honest. I apologize for the inconvenience. That was it. No elaboration, no public statement, no new theory, just disappearance. He boarded a quiet train to Konya. No entourage, no luggage beyond a backpack, a small notebook, and a now heavily marked Qur'an. He told no one where he was going, not his colleagues, not his assistant, not even his publisher. The man who once filled auditoriums to speak about illusion was now seeking stillness. Konya welcomed him with wind and dust, ancient streets, dervish footsteps, the graves of poets and mystics. It was here centuries ago that Jalal al-Din Rumi walked, wept, and spun, seeking the same clarity Malcolm now chased without knowing why. He rented a small stone house near the edge of the city. No TV, no phone signal, just a mat, a lamp, and a low wooden shelf that slowly began to collect translations of the Qur'an in English, Arabic, and even Latin. He read each verse now not to dissect but to digest. He was no longer asking, is this true? He was asking, if this is true, what does it demand of me? And that question began undoing the very foundations of his intellectual pride. He read Surah Al-Anfal. They plot, but Allah also plots, and Allah is the best of planners. Qur'an 8:30. He paused. For years he had seen himself as the chess master, always 4 moves ahead. But now, he saw he was never in control. He remembered the student who handed him the Qur'an in Istanbul. The timing, the phrasing, the tone. Everything orchestrated with a precision no logic could map. This wasn't coincidence. This was design. He spent his mornings in silent reflection and his nights with verses that stared back at him like mirrors. The Qur'an never told stories for entertainment. Every parable came with a purpose. Every line struck the ego where it hurt most. So which of the favors of your Lord will you deny? Qur'an 55:13. He wrote that verse down 50 times in his notebook. By the 20th time he was crying, not out of guilt, but because for the first time he realized how much he had been given and how little he had acknowledged the giver. He stopped writing articles, stopped responding to emails. One publisher threatened to sue for breach of contract. Another asked, is this some kind of spiritual crisis? He didn't reply. He wasn't in crisis, he was in clarity. And clarity didn't scream, it stilled him. One evening after reading Surah Yusuf, he wrote a sentence in his journal, this book is not literature, it is truth formatted as mercy. He closed the journal, walked outside, looked at the stars. He had once taught that the universe was indifferent, that awe was an emotional response to mathematical chance. But now he stood beneath the same stars and whispered, you made all this, and you knew I would take this long to admit it. He laughed, then wept, because he was finally learning something no lecture hall had taught him. The one who created thought is not limited by it. He had rehearsed it 100 times in his mind, not the words, the surrender. There was no logical framework for what he felt, no syllogism that could map the transformation. All the books he had read, Kant, Hume, Russell Derrida, none had prepared him for this. They had taught him how to ask questions, but not how to recognize the answer when it arrived. And here it was, not as a thunderclap, not as a vision, but as a sentence quietly circling his soul. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. The Shahada, 2 lines, simple enough to fit on a page, powerful enough to topple a man's life. It was Friday. The wind was cool. The city was quieting for Jumu'ah. Malcolm didn't go to the masjid. He wasn't ready for handshakes and embraces. Not yet. This moment wasn't for people. It was for God. He rolled up his prayer mat, the one the grocer's son had gifted him a few days earlier, with shy eyes and the words, just in case. He placed it down in the corner of his room. He sat cross-legged, heart thumping like a man facing a verdict. And in a voice softer than he ever used in debate halls, he spoke, Ashhadu alla ilaha illallah, wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Silence, no applause, no scholars present, no audience, just a man and his Lord. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't speaking to win. He was speaking to submit. He didn't cry, he just breathed. Deep, long, free. For decades he had worshipped intellect, sharpened logic until it became a blade. But now in a quiet house in Kenya, he had finally sheathed it. Not because it failed, but because it had served its purpose. It had led him to the edge. And reason alone cannot leap. Only sincerity can do that. He rose slowly, turned toward the Qibla just as he had learned. His movements were stiff, his pronunciation shaky. But when his forehead touched the ground, the earth felt like it had been waiting for him. He didn't know what to say in sujood, so he said the only thing that felt true, I'm yours. He stayed in that position a long time, not praying, just resting, as if he had walked for 50 years and only now laid down his burden. His reputation gone, his career ruined, his image collapsed. And yet, he had never felt so whole. Later that day, he walked through the market. A young man greeted him with "Assalamu alaikum." Malcolm hesitated, then smiled. "Wa alaikum assalam." The words felt like home. That evening, he opened the Qur'an again, not to study, but to sit with it, like an old friend he'd once mocked and now loved. He turned to Surah Al-Ankabut. Do the people think they will be left to say, "We believe," and they will not be tested? Quran 29. He smiled, closed the book. He was ready, not for perfection, but for obedience, not for answers to every question, but for peace with the one who held them all. That night, he wrote a short sentence in his notebook. Nothing elaborate, just this: I came to break the book. Instead, it broke me. Beautifully. They didn't understand. How could they? One day, Dr. Malcolm Reyes was headlining academic journals, quoted in ethics panels and televised debates. The next, he was silent, absent, vanished. And then the photo appeared, blurry, unassuming, taken by a tourist near the Selimiya Mosque in Edirne. A man in a simple white shirt and loose trousers, sitting cross-legged on the courtyard stones, Quran open forehead, touching the ground in sujud. No press, no lectures, no audience. But someone recognized the face. Is that Dr. Malcolm Reyes, the philosopher? What is he doing in a mosque? Within days, the internet did what it always does. Dr. Reyes abandons rationalism. Philosopher who dismissed God found praying to him. Conversion or breakdown, bloggers speculated. Colleagues recoiled. A prominent atheist forum published a farewell post calling his silence an unfortunate collapse into mysticism. The university removed his faculty page quietly. His publisher canceled his upcoming book. Invitations dried up. And Malcolm? He never replied, not because he couldn't, but because he no longer needed to. He returned to Kenya, grateful for the simplicity of a city that didn't care what degrees you held. He spent mornings at a local bookstore, helping organize shelves and drinking tea with a retired professor who taught him Arabic and slow melodic phrases. He spent afternoons tutoring children in logic and ethics, explaining to wide-eyed boys how the human mind works, but never pretending it could define the one who made it. And in the evenings, he cleaned the prayer hall of the small masjid near his flat. No lectures, no podiums, just peace. One night, a young student sent by his old university traveled to find him. He waited until Malcolm stepped outside the masjid after Isha, then approached cautiously. "Sir," the student said, breathless, "why did you leave everything behind? The acclaim, the legacy, the voice you had." Malcolm looked at him gently. "I didn't leave truth," he said. "I finally stopped mistaking myself for its author." The student blinked. "But you were our sharpest thinker." "I still think," Malcolm smiled. "I just no longer pretend that thought alone leads to peace." He had spent his whole life building towers of theory concepts stacked on concept truth, buried under layers of elegance. But Islam was a door, not a tower, and all it asked was that you bow and walk through. That winter, he completed his first full reading of the Quran in Arabic, slow, broken, sincere. He wept most at the end of Surah Al-Zumar, "Is one whose heart Allah has opened to Islam, so that he is upon a light from his Lord, like one who rejects Qur'an." 39:22. It wasn't brilliance that made faith possible, it was light. And light didn't need to be earned, just accepted. His former students never reached out again. His publishers sent silence. A few critics tried to bait him into public debates. One even challenged him to a televised reconversion dialogue. He declined them all. He wasn't hiding. He was just done performing. He used to fear death. Now he welcomed the idea of meeting the one he had once tried to disprove. Not with fear, but with love. He knew he would stand before him, and he wanted to arrive not as a man of ideas, but as a man of submission. One afternoon, he wrote a final letter, not for publication, just to himself. "I thought the intellect was king. Then I met a book that exposed its throne as hollow. I fought it. It didn't fight back. It just stood unbroken. Because truth doesn't panic when questioned. It waits. And when your pride finally collapses, it's still there. Unmoved, unbending, inviting." He folded the paper, placed it inside his Quran, and smiled. Not because he had all the answers, but because he had finally stopped pretending that he needed them to bow. It was just before Fajr when the knock came. Soft, hesitant, like someone unsure if they were allowed to seek. Malcolm now. Malik, to the few locals who knew, opened the door to find a young man with glasses and a satchel full of books. He looked nervous. I was told you might talk to me, the young man said. Come in, Malik said gently. They sat at the low table near the window, a pot of tea warming in silence. I studied under one of your students, the boy said, before you left. Malik offered a faint smile. I used to think you were dangerous, the boy continued. Too persuasive, too confident. Then I read your early work, then your retraction, and then he reached into his bag and pulled out a copy of the Qur'an. I read this, and I don't know what to do with it. Malik nodded slowly. I understand. It's not just the content, the boy said. It's the way it speaks. Like it doesn't need me to agree, it just is. Malik's eyes lit up. That's exactly what frightened me. He poured them both tea. I had spent decades mastering argumentation, he said, and this book didn't argue. It declared. It wasn't insecure. It didn't defend itself. It confronted me without flinching. The young man nodded. So what made you take the step? Malik looked out the window at the horizon, softening with pre-dawn light. I realized that knowing truth and obeying it are not the same. He sipped his tea. I had reached the edge of what logic could do. Beyond that, there's only one thing left. The boy whispered, surrender. They sat for a while in silence. Then the adhan floated in soft, haunting absolute. Malik rose. You can stay, he said. You don't have to pray, just listen. The boy nodded. They walked to the masjid. It was still dark, the courtyard stones cool underfoot. Inside, rows of men stood shoulder to shoulder, old, young, immigrant, native. No one asked Malik what he used to be. No one asked the boy why he looked unsure. They just made space. After prayer, they sat beneath the olive tree outside the masjid. The boy finally said, I don't know if I'm ready. Malik placed a hand on his shoulder. You're not being asked to leap into mystery. You're being asked to stand before clarity and stop running from it. The boy blinked. But I'm afraid of being wrong. Malik smiled. So was I. Until I realized that fear was pride in disguise. He looked him in the eyes. You don't have to understand everything. You just have to stop pretending you don't understand what this book is. That evening, Malik returned home and opened his journal. It was nearly full now. Verses in Arabic, scribbled reflections, notes of awe. He turned to the final page and wrote, I spent my life asking questions that impressed rooms full of thinkers. But when I stood alone before the one who answers without needing to explain, I finally stopped performing and started listening. This is what the philosophers never told us. Truth doesn't need to be proven infinite times. It only needs to be recognized once. I did not lose my mind. I laid it down in sujud. Later that night, the boy returned. He stood at the door trembling. I want to say it, he said. I want to say it like you did. Malik opened the door wide. No, he said softly. Say it better than I did. And beneath a sky washed with stars, the boy whispered the words that changed everything. Ashhadu alla ilaha illa Allah, wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of truth, full of peace, full of the sound reason makes when it finally bows. Dr. Malcolm Reyes spent his life believing truth could be conquered through reason, through critique, through debate. But in the end, it wasn't a contradiction that humbled him. It was a clarity that couldn't be outthought. We often equate surrender with weakness. But true surrender, sincere, informed, and conscious, is the highest act of strength. It requires us to lay down our pride, not our intellect. Islam didn't silence his reason, it completed it. Because the mind can take you to the door of truth, but only humility lets you walk through it. The lesson is simple yet eternal. You don't lose your identity by submitting to God. You lose the illusion that you are ever sovereign. And in that loss, you find what philosophers spend lifetimes seeking. Not a new argument, but peace. The kind that comes not from mastering truth, but from finally recognizing it.